The Chair will now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Bass, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to express my dissatisfaction at the majority's failure to allow consideration of amendments I proposed to the appropriations bill that includes funding for the FAA. The Rules Committee did not forward those items so my colleagues could consider and vote on them. My amendments represent beginning steps toward addressing what has become an intolerable level of noise from planes in my district. The amendments will not see debate in this body. However, despite the fact that noise affects the health, well-being, and economic livelihood of people in every part of the country, whether they are Republicans or Democrats. When Congress directed the FAA to update how we control our airways, we were promised that by reworking the nation's airspace and using satellite technology instead of radars, our nation's flight system would become not only more efficient, but cleaner and quieter. Next generation systems were supposed to allow virtually automated air traffic control, eliminate circling overhead waiting for a landing slot, and facilitate smooth gliding flight descents without noisy engine power. But planes would be able to stay higher longer. And FAA's published flight procedures would specify minimum altitudes over heavily populated areas meant to ensure that effects on the ground were minimized. That is not what we got. 8 of the country's busiest and most complex metropolitan areas, called metroplexes, have seen NextGen implementation so far. Phoenix, North Carolina, and Washington, D.C. are just a few of the Metroplex victims who have decided to take legal action against the FAA. The D.C. Circuit Court recently ruled in the Phoenix case, noting that the FAA had not paid enough attention to the effects of its actions. In every case, noise that used to be spread out across a wide area became concentrated over narrow corridors, visiting misery on those living below. The best analogy I can offer is this. Imagine that all of the traffic using a 6-lane highway was narrowed to a single lane. The concentration of that much traffic would surely cause considerable problems. Well, that's exactly what has happened in the Southern California Metroplex implementation. Areas that used to see planes flying overhead every 15 or 20 minutes now feel bombarded by flights as close together as every 3 minutes or less. As you can imagine, sometimes those planes in narrowed highways might get too close together. Air traffic controllers have to keep minimum separation for the safety of all involved. But in order to adhere to that narrow lane, controllers tell the pilots to deviate from the flight path by going downward. Sometimes they fly at half or less of what the minimum altitude is supposed to be. So planes that are supposed to fly at 6,000 feet may fly as low as 3,000 at frequencies of every 3 to 5 minutes. I hope that you can appreciate that that noise is intolerable. Film production of all kinds, whether TV commercials, movies, or videos, is a major economic driver in my district. The neighborhoods of the 37th Congressional District have been used to represent cities and towns across the continent. Though you might not know it, I'm sure you've seen both Culver City and the historic West Adams District, built over 100 years ago, in some of your favorite TV shows and movies. Unfortunately, the movie studios of Culver City and the homes of West Adams are directly under the new narrowed flight path. Studios are complaining about having to move movie production from their back lots because of the noise. I have elderly constituents who have lived in their neighborhoods for decades and who rely on income from location filming to help them remain in their homes. Film scouts have told them that the frequent loud plane traffic makes it impossible to film there anymore. At this point, countless American and European health studies have demonstrated the harms that come from exposure to noise, and at much lower levels than experienced by people on the ground. The arbitrary and outdated 65 decibel day-night level that the FAA uses to determine acceptable levels of exposure is calculated at an average sound of over a 24-hour period. Parents with young children have told me that their kids' sleep patterns have been disrupted by unrelenting noise, enough to alter their academic performance. A health clinic serving the affected areas has begun to investigate whether a spike in reported health problems, including poor control of chronic conditions like hypertension, can be related to the constant exposure to excessive noise. The European Union standard for noise exposure at night is half of the U.S. level and is still cause for health concerns there. In the absence of consideration of my amendments, I invite my colleagues to join me and nearly 40 other colleagues in the House Quiet Skies Caucus, which is working to make progress on this important issue. My constituents, and I know many of my colleagues' constituents, are suffering under the burden of excessive airplane noise as a result of the implementation of the FAA's Next Generation project. We cannot and must not sacrifice the health of those on the ground in the name of airline efficiency. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.